What's it like to confront drug addiction, depression, spinal problems, 2 hip replacements, intestinal resection with colostomy and cancer? And then to write about all of that in a series of novels? Stay with us.
Welcome to Lean to the Left, home of no-holds-barred commentary, plus interviews with fascinating people. Some of them top experts, others simply with interesting stories to tell. You'll never know who'll show up at Lean to the Left. Now here's your host, Bob Gatty.
David Feldman has confronted so many serious health problems in his life that it's a wonder he's still standing. He's faced drug addiction, depression, spinal problems that nearly led to paralysis, 2 hip replacements, intestinal resection with colostomy, and cancer. But instead of letting all of that beat him, what's Feldman done? He's written a bunch of books in which his characters overcome life's greatest hurdles. In fact, Feldman's the author of 8 books, including his 6th book, Dora Ellison Mystery Series, and a standalone literary novel, The Neighborhood, which focuses on racism. And oh, by the way, Feldman's an accomplished working musician and artist. He's an award-winning filmmaker, too. His play, Love Lives On, was a winner of the Artists in Partnership Inaugural Playwriting Contest. He's been the owner of eFace Media, that's eFace.com, EFFACE.com, since 1989, which provides web design, videography, brand development, and digital services, among others. Hey, David, welcome to Lean to the Left, buddy.
Thank you, Bob. Great to be here.
Hey, tell us about your story, David. How is it that you faced all these serious health issues and still been able to produce all of this creative work and even run a company, for crying out loud?
In a way, I have to say that I had no choice, because if you squeeze an orange, you get orange juice. If you squeeze me, you get art.
Yeah.
You squeeze art, yeah. You squeeze me, you get art. I'm sorry about that. So I've been running this company, eFace Media, eFace.com, since 1989, and that's gone along just fine. And in recent years, I've really scaled it down, and much of my income from that is passive. Not that it's so much income. So what's happened is that about 4 years ago, I started to have issues. I had trigger finger. I'm a piano player, and I play in restaurants and in bands, and I play quite a lot for seniors. And I would find that if I made a fist, if I closed my hand and I opened it, my ring finger wouldn't open. And so they call that trigger finger, and it's not good for a piano player. And so I had surgery on that, and it wasn't all that big a deal. My brother actually had it recently. My brother's a singer, a fine singer. Then I found right after that, maybe 3-4 months later, I had a double hernia. Again, not too big a deal. Don't know why I had it. Right about then, I took the motorcycle safety course. I bought my first Harley at age 61.
Okay.
After not riding motorcycles for 40 years. I rode them in my 20s and started riding again in my 60s. And early in that course, you spend probably the first half hour pushing your motorcycle. And I think that's how I ended up with the double hernia. But anyway, about 6 months later, I found I needed a hip replacement.
Okay.
And that was not fun, but I had the hip replacement. And again, life goes on. These are things that happen. You get older and you have some of these things. And that's okay. And a while after that, though, I again playing piano out in the Hamptons and on the east end of Long Island in a nice steak and sushi joint. And I found that my hands were not working so well. And not only that, but I was starting to stumble when I walked. Now, I've been clean and sober since 94. So it wasn't alcohol. It wasn't booze. So I went to a doctor. And I remember on my way to the doctor, my wife and I were on the phone. I was in the car, and she said, "For goodness sake, don't make any more surgery appointments." And I said, "Honey, I'm going to see a surgeon. I'm having these crazy I'm losing dexterity in my hands. Feet are cold all the time. My hands and feet are numb. I'm stumbling when I walk. I can't write well. I can't play piano well. I'm going to see what the doctor says. And that's what's really going to determine what happens. And the doctor said, you're heading towards paralysis, because I had to have an MRI. And after the MRI, he said, the vertebrae are pressing not outward into nerves, which is what happens very often with people with spine issues, but inward into the spine. And they were blocking impulses. Everything you do is governed by electrical impulses that travel through your spine, and that stuff was being blocked. So I couldn't walk. My brain was telling my feet to move and my hands to work, and the impulses, the messages were not getting through. So I needed to have a plate put in my neck, and I had to have the lamin around one of the vertebrae removed, and screws and bolts and stuff put in there. And that was really a drag.
Yeah.
And then as bad as that, and I was okay. I came home from that, and I started to have, right after, 3 days later, actually, the first symptoms were sooner. It was about 2 days later. I started to have these monster, crazy hiccups that would literally lift me out of my chair. And I'd bounce up. Crazy, wild hiccups.
Wow.
And then I started to get physically ill, like Exorcist, throwing up for distance.
Ooh.
And I went to the 24-hour ER. I live in Long Beach, New York, where there used to be a hospital, but ever since Hurricane Sandy, there's no more. The hospital was destroyed. Everything here was underwater in Hurricane Sandy. My home, everything. And that's another thing that happened. And the ER said, you have air in your intestines, and we need to put you in an ambulance, send you to a hospital that's about 20 minutes north of here, and you're going to have your intestines, a piece of your intestines cut out, or it's called a resection, and you might wake up with a bag. And I said, wait, what? And that's exactly what happened. I woke up with a colostomy, and I had to poop out my belly for 3 months. So then they were able to reverse that, which is not always the case. There's people with things like Crohn's disease and other things, irritable bowel, some folks who have these, they live with them forever. So I had that fixed, and I knew I was going to need the other hip was going. And all of this is in the last 5 years. Wow. And I was all set to have my other hip replaced last April. And a doctor told I had to have a bunch of blood tests for the hip replacement. And right at the end, just as I was about to have, about a week before the hip replacement, my urologist called me and he said, you have prostate cancer.
Oh, boy.
And you can't have your hip replaced. Oh. So I had to have treatment. Look, prostate cancer, if you're going to have cancer, some people say if you're going to have cancer, you should have prostate cancer. And I'm not sure I see it that way. I don't want any cancer. I don't know that any cancer is the cancer to get, but at the same time, I was diagnosed, my best friend was diagnosed with pancreatic, and he's gone. Right. He was very sick. He got very sick for about 2 months and died. Yeah. So I had to wait to have my hip replaced, and eventually I did. In December, I finally had my hip replaced, and during all of this, I was writing because, first of all, I was able to sit still. That's something I could do. I couldn't walk very well. The cancer really was not visible to me. The primary symptom I had from that was fear, was anxiety and terror. And I joined a bunch of prostate cancer groups on Facebook, and one that is like a phone group with a bunch of older men. I was one of the younger guys, and I was one of the healthier guys. There were guys there with stage 4 cancer that began as prostate cancer and they were living. I also communed with a bunch of musicians, or 2 musicians on there, and we talked a lot about music. And music is very healing. Music is really the answer to a lot of my spiritual issues, and as is writing. And I was able to process a lot of this through my writing. And while I do give various of my issues to my characters, That's not really what my books are about. Most of my books, the majority of my books now are mysteries, and I did write this novel about 4 families in the town I grew up in, which is Valley Stream, New York, which back then was 99% white, more than 99% white. And the book surrounds racism. It's about the first Black family. It's a novel, it's fiction, about the first Black family that moves in and what happens between 4 families, and one of them is that first family of color to move in.
And which book is that?
That's called The Neighborhood. It's a standalone novel, and it's again, it's about racism, but it's also a love story. All my books are love stories and mysteries. They're mysteries because hopefully, as you're reading, you want to know what happens next. So in a way, that's the definition of a mystery. You want to keep reading what's going to happen. And there's always love in my books because I think love is really the answer to a lot of the world's ills.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let me ask you this. How is it that during the period that you're undergoing all of these health issues, which must have been extremely traumatic, and I just had a hip replacement myself, so I know what you went through with that, and that's not easy recovering from. So while you were going through all of these health things, you were able to sit down and create these books. You brought in some of your own health experiences. I guess you gave those to some of your characters, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And you did that. Why?
Because I needed to. Because that's how I process these things. I read mostly mysteries. At night before I go to bed, I read for a couple of hours. And it's very helpful for me to see people who are in much more dire straits than I am. The people in these mysteries they're on the receiving end of real bad stuff. Yeah. And most of the time in mysteries, the good guy wins.
Yeah.
The bad guy or the bad girl is caught or killed. And that doesn't always happen in life. We don't always see things work out the way we want them to, or things are not always fair. So reading mysteries is helpful for me to make sense of the world. And writing them also helps me to make sense of life and make sense of the world. And it takes my focus off my own problems. With my health situations, I was, for the most part, able to sit on my couch with my laptop in my lap and type. So I was able to write. Once I started moving, all bets were off. Especially the most painful of all of these things really were the hip replacements. Yeah. And because I had to postpone my second hip replacement because of the cancer, I was in a lot of pain. From August, the second hip replacement was this past December 7th. So from August through December, I was using a walker and I was in a lot of pain. But if I sat on the couch and just sat on the couch with my laptop, I was okay. I wasn't in pain. So that's really how I was able to do it. And spiritually and psychologically, it was important for me because it took my focus off my own problems and enabled me to focus on others. And to the degree my problems intruded on my consciousness, I gave some of these issues to my characters.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I had to. My family has a streak of depression running through it. I would even say galloping through it.
Wow.
And we have had some suicides in my family, not my immediate family, but in my extended family. And so I gave that to my main character in my Dora Ellison Mystery Series. Dora Ellison has PTSD and anxiety and depression-related issues that come from trauma. I had some trauma early in life. I was around some violence early in life, and I gave that to her. It's a different situation, but she lives with that all her life. And she's a little bit like, she has a streak of Jack Reacher in her. Jack Reacher is the main character in the Lee Child, the famous Lee Child series and now TV series. where Jack Reacher doesn't like bullies. He runs into bullies, or he runs into a town run by a bunch of bullies, kind of like some of the old westerns, Bad Day at Black Rock and movies like that. And, and he mops up the street with them. And Dora does a little bit of that. And she runs into bullies in every book. And she teaches them a lesson. She's a tough cookie. She's physically strong. In book 1, she starts off as a garbage collector. And that made her physically very strong. She's lifting garbage cans and flipping them over with one hand. And she's a beast. She's a big, strong girl.
How did you decide to make her a garbage collector?
People ask that, and people ask about where these characters came from and why I'm writing about 2 women who are lovers. What do I know about lesbian? And the answer is I don't know. The characters decide that for me. The characters show up, and I write about them, and I don't know. They
just show up, huh?
They just write themselves, and
that's amazing.
They're using my fingers and my pen and my computer to write their own stories.
That's amazing. Now, your books touch on issues of the day, much like this podcast does, focusing on such issues as bigotry to gender issues,
right,
to the lives of people with special needs. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
What do you see in society today that makes these topics important and relevant?
Dora doesn't like bullies, and she runs across bullies on a small scale. Someone's beating their dog, or there's a fellow with cerebral palsy getting picked on, and she makes things right. In a larger macro sense, in society, I think there's a lot of bullying going on. I think that the weaker people in society are perpetually beaten on by the stronger people and by the wealthier people. And I grew up in a household where we cared about people less fortunate than us. We cared about poor people. We cared about folks of color and racism. I have someone in my family who has pretty severe special needs. She'll never walk. She'll never speak. She doesn't see to her own physical needs. She needs help, and she will need help forever. And so I think it's important to speak up for these people. And these issues show up in my books. They show up in politics, and they show up in my books.
Okay. Now, in addition to writing all of these books, you do ghostwriting, right?
Yeah, that's a big part of how I make my living, is I ghostwrite books for other people and other things as well. But yeah.
And it says here you recently completed a ghostwriting project about the history of people of a particular heritage in the U.S. military. What heritage was that?
Muslim.
Okay. You also ghosted a romance novel and a how-to book about fishing. Is there anything you don't write about? Actually, that's a facetious question.
Yeah.
The fishing book, that got me, because I'll tell you what, a few years ago, I guess maybe about 8 years ago, I was learning how to fly fish. And I had this friend who I met. He was a great big burly guy with red hair and a big red beard. And he was a friend of mine that they introduced us. We actually thought about writing a book about fly fishing. But in the end, the guy was just too difficult to work with because he couldn't even type. And
that's not good.
And the only way to get information from him was sit and interview him and take notes. And it just got to be too tedious, so I dropped the project.
I just want to say something to that. A book fell into my lap that is really not in the notes because it was published by a university press about 15 years ago. It's a book, and it's a cool book. It's called Pilgrimage from Darkness, and it's about a fellow who grew up in Nazi Germany. It's a true story, a memoir of this fellow who grew up in Nazi Germany during Hitler's rise to power. He was a typical kid. He wanted to. There were parades in his area, and he wanted to be in the parades. And who was marching in the parades? Nazis. So he joined the Hitler Youth because that was what all the cool boys did. All the cool, tough boys who played soccer and everything were in the Hitler Youth. and eventually he was in the Luftwaffe. So he fought for the Nazis, but in the long run, he realized what his country did and went on a spiritual search and sampled all of the world's religions and eventually settled in Israel and married a Holocaust survivor and converted to Judaism. And the reason I bring up this book is that this fella had a very thick German accent, and we wrote the book by him telling his story into 16 tapes on a tape recorder, which he then, I never met him, which he then sent to me in New York. And I wrote the book that way. And
wow.
It was brutal because his accent was so thick. I had to listen to things 4 and 5 times. It took a year just to do that. And then I had to research everything that he said. And
sure.
The fishing book was brought to my attention by someone who knew me through other means. And he decided he's a guy who's on disability and he has almost no money, and but he fishes all the time. He fishes 4 or 5 days a week. He goes out on party boats and fishes. And someone had said, talk to Dave, and about if you want to write a book, talk to Dave. And so we came to an agreement where I operate on a sliding scale. I'm not that worried about the money. I want to get paid for my work. It has value, but I'm not that worried about the money. We figured out something that we could both live with. And we started writing this book 8 years ago, and we're still writing it. But here's the thing. The book was done 5 years ago. The book was done 5 years ago, but he likes the process.
Yeah.
And he just keeps, every time he wins a pool, he comes over and we add another page or two to the book. And he's turned into a great writer. He has a 6th grade education and he can't spell anything, but he knows what sounds good, and he writes he's writing everything now. I just transcribe it for him and he pays me a few dollars, and that's what we do. Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting.
And the book's not for sale because he's on disability and he's afraid that if the book shows up in Amazon, he could lose his disability because the disability police will say, you could write a book, you can't be on disability.
Right.
What do I know? This is people show up.
So the guy's not going to actually publish the book? That's a shame.
No. And it's a great book. He knows all about tying flies and all.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yeah, not flies because he's not a freshwater fisherman, but lures. He knows all about. He knows all about. He can think like a fish.
This guy that I was doing this fishing book with, or at least I thought about doing this fishing book with, wanted me to go fly fishing with him, saltwater fly fishing with him to Belize. And I'm going like, what? Really? We never did it, but it sounded like a great idea. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So we don't want to talk about my experiences. We want to talk about yours. Now, we live today in a society that it just seems there's so many divisions. I just know in my own family, for example, there are people who don't talk to me because close relatives, like a brother, who barely talks to me because of my left-leaning political views and his Trumpism addiction. And we see this all over the place. What's your view about all of that? And how does that play, I think, into what you do as an artist?
Oh, that covers a lot of ground.
Hey, we'll get his response to that question when we come back after this quick break.
As far as the divisions between people, there are greater divisions than there have ever been, and there's less courtesy and less ability to have dialogue than there's ever been.
Yeah.
And I'm guilty of it too, because there's people that I don't speak with, that I have unfriended on Facebook and I've stepped away from because They have views that are the polar opposite of my own. And in fact, I used to go out to breakfast with a bunch of guys just quite a few years ago, maybe 6, 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was after 2016. So it was when Trump was in office. And one of the fellows, soft-spoken guy I was friendly with, started talking about Trump. And a couple of us, myself and another guy, really lit into this fella. And the fella got up and left, and I lost my friendship to this fella. And I regret that because I liked him. We were friends, and we supported each other through challenges in life. That part of it, I regret that there's the kind of vision that has caused people to be caustic and not nice. And I think a lot of it comes from people we see on the news. And I think a lot of it, to me, there is one person who's at the root of all of this. I don't know if it's Trump. I think Rupert Murdoch is at the root of a lot of the problems that we see nowadays, because we're seeing it come out in the news now, that Tucker Carlson didn't like Trump. Supposedly, at least that's the headline I saw just yesterday, that Tucker Carlson really didn't like Trump, and yet he was fomenting on Trump's behalf. But the other thing is, I don't talk very much about this. This podcast that we're doing, for me, is very much an outlier. Not so much because your views are outlier views. I actually share your views. And when I was growing up, I grew up in a family of activists, and I was knocking on doors for Eugene McCarthy in 1968.
Okay.
Eight. And I didn't know what I was doing. My parents just sent me out to do that, and people were slamming doors and yelling at me. But I don't talk about politics very much on podcasts, because here's the thing. Republicans, at least some of them, read books.
At least some of them.
I don't want to say too much. But look, I want everyone to read my books. I want everyone to buy my books. That's
all right, so you don't want to tick off the Republicans. All right. I was going to ask you what you think about the presidential election coming up.
You can, and okay. It's okay. So here's the thing: you did ask about what I do in my stories, and I do put these issues in my stories because I think the fact that people of color, people who are poor, who don't have access to some of the goods and services of society in the way that many of us do, who don't have access to health care, who have special needs, who have different points of view about gender. These people are on the receiving end of some bad stuff in society. And I think that's not fair. And I talk about that in my book and in my books, and I show it in my books, and some of them are on the receiving end of murder in my books, although I don't make my books overtly political in that way. But I do put some of that in my... See, what I've found is once I start talking to people with different views, and we get off the Fox News and we get the hot button issues the way they're spoken about in the press, I've found that we agree about a lot. In fact, I had an experience recently speaking with someone, and we were talking about a lot of these things, and we found we agreed.
Okay.
And at the end of the conversation, I said, where's the disagree? And we ended up getting back to the way things are talked about in the news. And listen, I think some out and out lies are put out there. And I'll say right away, I think Fox News, I don't see any moral equivalence. People I know talk about, they say, well, you think Fox News is bad. What about MSNBC? And I say, what about them? I don't think there's any moral equivalency between MSNBC and Fox News. I think one of them puts out and out lies, stirs up BS, and has people like we have a minority in the House of Representatives that are effing crazy.
Yep, absolutely.
I think these people are nuts. And if I lose some readers, so be it. It's not like I have so many readers anyway. Some people read my books, but I don't have millions and millions of readers, and I'm not worried about pissing off 10 people.
Yeah.
And I think, look, there are sane Republicans. I think Bob Dole, I wouldn't agree with a lot of what he had to say. I didn't I'm not a fan of Ronald Reagan, I have to say, and that has a lot to do with the House Un-American Committee and people like Pete Seeger and I can't think of what his name is, the author who was married to Marilyn Monroe. Folks who had political views who were put on trial because of them. I just think that's wrong. And you get to listen. We live in a country where you get to believe whatever you want, and I just think that people who think that what happened on January 6th of a year and a half ago, if they think that's okay, they're crazy. And some of the Republican senators spoke up about that yesterday and the day before and said so. And I think they're right. I don't agree with a lot of what Mitt Romney has to say, but he said that, and I agree with him there.
Looking at the 24 presidential election, we've got on the Republican side, we've got DeSantis, who hasn't announced but shows every sign that he's going to. Perhaps by the time this thing airs, he will have announced. And of course, Trump. And then we've got lesser lights, the Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina, where I live. And she's walking a tightrope of wanting to get the nomination, but afraid to piss off the Trump crowd. So anyway, that's on the Republican side. And then on the Democratic side, of course, we've got President Biden and others waiting to see what he's going to do. What are your thoughts about all of that?
First of all, I'm interested to see if any of this comes back to bite me in the ass. Talking about this stuff as an author, because it's something that I've really not done very much of. But so my thoughts about all of that, I happen to think Biden's terrific.
You think Biden's what?
Terrific.
Okay.
I like him. Yeah. I liked Obama. I like Biden. I think that the Affordable Health Care Act, it's not so affordable, is good because it enables people to have access to health care. I don't know that much about the ins and outs of that, but I don't like Trump. I think he's crazy. I'm interested to see if he and DeSantis beat each other up and what'll happen there. That's the best thing that could happen. I'm a Democrat. I'm a liberal Democrat. As I get older, what's the actual definition of conservative is not wanting things to change very much. And when it comes to fiscal things, and when it comes to Medicare, and when it comes to Social Security, I would say it's a truly conservative view to want to keep those things and to not want to change Medicare or Social Security because they're a big part of my life. I still make some money in my business, but I like Social Security. I'm on Social Security. I'm on Medicare. I've given my Medicare quite a workout in the last few years. And I'm very happy. And I have paid almost nothing for it. And I'm very pleased because I've seen on paper what my surgeries cost. My first hip replacement was something like $80,000. It's crazy.
I know. You must have a good supplemental then to go along with your Medicare.
I have ARP. It seems to be pretty good. I don't get any bills. I've had maybe $50 in bills for all of that stuff. Although quite a bit of it, I'm 60. I just turned 66 a few weeks ago. My supplemental is ARP, and I have had, since I've been on Medicare, I've seen maybe $60, $70 in bills total. Before that, my first hip replacement, I paid $6,500 for because that was my out-of-pocket. And my abdominal surgery, I paid $6,500 for because that was my out-of-pocket. The follow-up, I didn't pay for it because I'd already paid my out-of-pocket. So that's the way that worked. I'm blessed that I'm not wealthy, but I have that money. I have a few dollars in the bank. I have some retirement. And as long as we don't have another hurricane where I live in Long Beach, which is a barrier island off of New York, I have a house that's worth some money.
Good.
I'd like to sell it and get the money, but then I have to talk to my wife about that.
I know what that's about.
And she has a good job too. I'm married to a scientist, so climate, and she's an environmental scientist. So we talk about climate change quite a bit.
Oh wow! Maybe I'll have her on my show because I love to talk about that. Hey, what's your goal in writing all these books? What's your goal?
My goal for me is I would love for them to be a significant part of my pension,
Okay.
as is music. My music is a significant part of my pension. I play
Okay.
piano mostly for seniors, but also in restaurants and so forth. And I sing also. I love to sing.
Okay.
My goal, entertainment. So it's a combination of entertainment to write a good mystery. I am really transported. I really find my way of dealing with a lot of what I see in the news. We talk about it at the dinner table, but is by putting these things in my books and reading about them in other people's books. Reading is a big deal to me. I didn't get much of an education because I was a bad boy. I was in a lot of trouble when I was a kid, but I read constantly, and I'm a
Yeah.
big fan of people like John Steinbeck, who wrote about poor people and also wrote terrific books. Grapes of Wrath and East of Eden are two of my favorite books. So I'd like to write good mysteries, other books as well. I'm writing a book. It's essentially about my father, although I changed the person's name and identity because I can't think through my father's brain and in his eyes. So I fictionalized it a bit. But my father had polio at 2, and I'm writing a book called Percival about someone who has polio and transcends it the way my father transcended his polio. And he was a working jazz musician and mowed the lawn, and he did everything. He could climb a ladder with his hands. My father was really something, and I want to honor him by writing that book. So I want to write books that people enjoy the way I enjoy books, and I hope to have a lot of read. I have some readers of my mystery series because people do order the books via pre-order. So essentially, I hope that answered your question. I was a little all over the place there, but
Okay. Yeah, it does. You also indicated earlier that you found doing this writing to be helpful mentally.
yes,
I'm not quite sure what the word
absolutely.
is I'm looking for, but
Emotionally,
yeah.
spiritually, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, those are all different facets of my mind. Yeah, books help me to transcend and adapt to life. I had depression. I've been clean and sober for decades, for almost 30 years, 29
Mhm.
years. And books are a big part of that, whatever the case may be. And I infuse my books with those things because that's what I got. All I can do is put into my books what I got.
You you brought up the issue about being clean and sober. Had you been having some difficulty with booze before that?
I had difficulty with booze. I had difficulty with cocaine and marijuana. My drug of choice is more. Whatever you got. What do you have? That's what I
Oh,
wanted.
wow.
That's what I did in high school. I stopped attending high school when I was in 9th or 10th grade. I was sent away to a private school that was very strict. I was Jewish, and it was a Christian school, and you had to go to chapel every day and sing and wear a suit. One of these strict Christian private schools. And
Wow.
but going there got me into a college. And when I was in college, I hung around with the rugby crowd, and I smoked a lot of marijuana, and I did a lot of cocaine, and I got myself into trouble. But I love to read,
Okay.
and reading really helped me. And John Steinbeck really helped me. And I read a lot of science fiction, and the guy who wrote Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451. Ray Bradbury's work and John Steinbeck's work. I don't know if my writing is anywhere near up to snuff with regard to them, but both of those guys influenced and infused my writing style with what it
Okay.
is today. And so that's where that's what I know is reading and writing, and not and definitely not arithmetic. I'm not a math and science guy. My wife and my sons, I'm the dumbest one in my family. My wife is a scientist. Both of my children are really smart, and then there's me.
Some of your background there. I was a horrible student, and when I decided to go to college, they asked me, "What is it you want to major in?" And I said, "Anything but math or science." And they said, "Why don't you become a writer because you're really good?" And so I did. And I
Yeah,
did that for 50 plus years.
yeah. There you go. I do want to say one thing. You asked about clean and sober. So
Yeah.
one day I used to be high. I was high from about 1971 or so until 1991 or so. And one day, my son, who was born, my first son was born in 1990, my second son in 1994, which is the week of my sobriety date, my clean date. But my first son was about a year and a half old, and one day I was taking care of him, and I was high. I'd had a few, and he got hurt.
Okay.
And it was over. On that day, I would have done anything. I was very proud to be a father, and there I was doing the wrong thing, and my son got hurt, and I became ready to change. And I believe, despite, I don't know if it's despite all the things I've said, I am someone who has come to believe in something bigger than us, and that has the spiritual connection I have to whatever it is. I do use the word God, but that's a stand-in for just some stuff that I don't understand, that I don't think science has quite figured out yet. So that stuff is a big deal to me, spirituality. Okay. And I have people in my books who are active addicts and alcoholics and who are clean and sober and are involved in programs about getting clean and sober, which is something I don't really talk much about here.
Okay. All right. So where can people find your books, David?
So all of my books right now are in Kindle Unlimited. So you'd look for David E. Feldman. The E is important. There's a David Feldman who writes a lot of other stuff. Feel free to buy his books, but I hope you buy mine. My David E. Feldman, and my website is also that, David E. Feldman. And when you get there, there's a doorway for music. You can hear my music if you want. But all my books, there's links to all of my books there, and box sets and all kinds of things. So,
okay, I suggest you guys listening and watching to check out his website, davidefeldman.com. I did that, and it's a great site, and everything you need to find his books and to learn about his books is right there. So what's ahead for you, David? What's going on?
So I'm writing 2 books right now. I'm writing book 6 in my series, my Dora Ellison Mystery Series, called The Divisive Storm. It's essentially about racism, and we see a lot of, I don't really think it's necessary. It's associated with far right, but there's a lot of thinking. People believe some really crazy things now. And I have some of that in my books because I think it's really important to draw attention to it. And there's some of that.
What are you talking about? What are the crazy things? QAnon. All right, sure.
And there are other things too, but that sort of stuff.
Okay.
That people just have nutty ideas, like flying saucers, stuff that's just so outrageous.
Yeah.
And so I have some of that in. I'm about fit. Once I get going in a book, it moves fast. So I've been writing for about 3 weeks, and I'm on about page 50 or 60. A Divisive Storm. It's about racism, but it's also got some crazy ideas, and it's also a pretty good mystery where a guy gets killed at the beginning of the book, and there's all kinds of connections to all kinds of things, and what happened, and Dora and her new love interest, new in book 2, Missy Winters, who's a librarian. By the way, I'm a big fan of librarians, and Missy is the Watson to Dora's Sherlock, although I guess the roles are a little reversed because Missy's very smart. And when anyone says, "How did you figure that out, Missy?" she says, "I'm a librarian." And she's very cool. And that's my degree of my master's is in librarian research. So I'm writing that, and I'm writing this book that's essentially about my dad called Percival. Okay. And both of those will be out at the end of the summer.
Okay. We're looking forward to those, that's for sure. I know I am. David E. Feldman, thank you so much for being with us today on the Lean to the Left podcast. I know we got you talking a little bit about politics, which you don't usually do because you don't want to piss off the Republicans. But I do understand that you need people to buy your books regardless of their political persuasion, right?
Sure, yeah. Maybe I'll help them somehow.
Okay, my friend. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
This was lots of fun. Thanks so much, Bob.
Now one more break, and I'll be right back with some closing comments. Hey guys, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed this podcast and that you'll come back on a regular basis and check out our interviews with guests on topics that I hope you find interesting, entertaining, and enlightening. Our episodes stream weekly, every Monday. Let your friends know about this podcast and take a minute to subscribe. Just go to podcast.leantotheleft.net and subscribe. Check out the upcoming interview schedule and listen to all of our episodes. And follow us on social media. Facebook at the Lean to the Left Podcast, Twitter at Lean to the Left 1, Instagram at @BobGatty_Lean to the Left, and TikTok at Lean to the Left. And you can watch the episodes at YouTube at Lean to the Left. And don't forget to visit our blog site, leantotheleft.net, where you'll find commentary on the news by some excellent writers with progressive perspectives on a whole range of topics. You can sign up as a member there, and of course, it's all free. Now, this is Bob Gatty signing off for Lean to the Left. Thanks for sharing your time with us.